The pre-dawn darkness over the central Pacific hung thick and oppressive on the morning of February 19, 1944. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, a metallic bitterness that coated the tongue and throat of every man who breathed it. Aboard the USS Maryland, a young Marine private named Daniel McKiernan gripped his M1 Garand so tightly his knuckles had gone white beneath the grime that had accumulated during the voyage. The rifle's wood stock was slick with the nervous sweat that had been building on his palms for hours. Around him, in the belly of the battleship-turned-temporary troop transport, hundreds of other Marines sat in similar silence, their faces illuminated only by the red combat lights that cast everything in the color of dried blood. Some men checked their equipment for the 100th time, fingers moving automatically through rituals that had become muscle memory. Others stared at nothing, their eyes focused on distances that existed only in their minds. A few whispered prayers. Most simply waited with the peculiar patience of men who know that in a few hours they will either be dead or wishing they were. The ship's engines thrummed beneath their boots, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to sync with the racing pulses of the men who would soon pour out of landing craft and onto a beach that existed in their minds only as lines on a map and grainy reconnaissance photographs. They were 8 miles offshore from a speck of volcanic rock in the Pacific that most Americans had never heard of, a place the Japanese called Iwo Jima, meaning Sulphur Island. The name was perfectly literal. The island stank of sulfur even from miles away when the wind was right. A reminder that this was geologically active ground, a place where the earth itself seemed angry and inhospitable to human life. In less than 2 hours, these men would storm beaches that Japanese command had spent 18 months fortifying with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on the pathological. They would assault beaches that Japanese commanders believed could not be taken in less than 2 months of grinding. Brutal combat that would break the American will to continue advancing toward the Japanese home islands. The Japanese had calculated every variable, accounted for every advantage they held, prepared for a siege that would bleed the Americans white, and force them to reconsider their entire strategic approach to the Pacific War. They had built something they called an impregnable fortress, a masterpiece of defensive engineering that represented the pinnacle of Japanese military fortification doctrine. They were about to discover they had built a tomb for 21,000 men, a monument to miscalculation so fundamental it would help shape the final months of the war. The island itself measured barely 8 square miles, a misshapen pork chop of black volcanic sand dominated by a 550-foot extinct volcano called Mount Suribachi at its southern tip. From above, from the perspective of reconnaissance aircraft, it looked insignificant, a smudge of dark land against the endless blue of the Pacific. Up close, it was a nightmare landscape of volcanic sand beaches rising at steep angles, plateaus of broken volcanic rock, and in the north, a wilderness of ravines and rocky ridges that seemed designed by a malevolent intelligence specifically to maximize casualties for any attacking force. There were no trees to speak of, no vegetation except scrub brush and patches of coarse grass. There was no fresh water except what could be collected from rain. There were no natural harbors, no protected anchorages, no geographical features that made human habitation pleasant or easy. It was, by any conventional measure, worthless real estate. And yet, for both the Empire of Japan and the United States of America in early 1945, this miserable volcanic rock represented strategic value so immense that both sides were willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives to possess it. For the Empire of Japan, Iwo Jima represented something far more valuable than its meager size and inhospitable terrain suggested. It sat almost exactly halfway between the Mariana Islands, recently captured by American forces in bitter fighting, and the Japanese home islands themselves. American B-29 Superfortress bombers flying from the Marianas to strike Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other Japanese industrial centers had to make the journey without fighter escort, because the distance exceeded the range of even the long-legged P-51 Mustangs that had proved so effective in the European theater. This meant the B-29s were vulnerable to Japanese fighters for the entire mission profile. Iwo Jima was a dagger pointed directly at the heart of the American strategic bombing campaign. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima could intercept the bombers on their way to and from targets. Japanese radar installations on the island could provide early warning of American raids, allowing defenses at the target cities to prepare. Japanese bombers based on Iwo Jima could even strike at the American bases in the Marianas, though such missions were rare given the deteriorating state of Japanese naval aviation by early 1945. For the Americans, the strategic calculation was equally stark and precisely opposite. If they could take Iwo Jima, crippled bombers returning from raids over Japan would have an emergency landing field instead of having to ditch in the Pacific, where rescue was uncertain at best. American fighters could be based on Iwo Jima to escort the bombers all the way to their targets and back, dramatically increasing bomber survivability and mission effectiveness. The island could serve as a base for air-sea rescue operations, with patrol craft and search aircraft operating from its waters to pick up downed airmen. It could host weather stations that would improve bombing accuracy and mission planning. Every dimension of the strategic calculation favored taking the island despite the obvious difficulties that the terrain and expected Japanese resistance would present. The noose around the Japanese home islands would tighten another crucial notch. American air superiority, already overwhelming, would become absolute. The final phase of the war would be accelerated. Both sides understood the mathematics of the island's importance with crystalline clarity. What they disagreed about, catastrophically for one side, was the mathematics of how long the battle would last and what it would cost. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had assumed command of Iwo Jima's defense in June 1943, arriving on the island with a reputation as one of the more thoughtful and innovative officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. A career officer who had served as a military attaché in Washington and Ottawa before the war, Kuribayashi understood Americans in a way many of his peers did not. He had traveled extensively across the United States, observed American industry firsthand, walked American streets, and spoken with American people. He had seen Detroit's automobile factories and understood what industrial capacity at that scale meant when converted to military production. He had observed the American character, the peculiar blend of informality and efficiency, the lack of rigid hierarchy combined with effective organization. He knew that the Bushido spirit alone, the samurai willingness to die gloriously in suicidal charges, would not defeat an enemy with such overwhelming industrial capacity and such different cultural assumptions about warfare. So he devised something different, something that broke with Japanese military doctrine in fundamental ways that would prove controversial among his fellow officers, but which represented perhaps the most intelligent defensive plan conceived by Japanese forces in the entire Pacific. War. There would be no banzai charges squandering men in suicidal glory that satisfied traditional notions of warrior honor but accomplished nothing tactically. There would be no defense at the waterline, where American naval gunfire could annihilate his forces before the battle properly began. Instead, Kuribayashi would turn the entire island into a subterranean fortress, a three-dimensional warren of interconnected tunnels, caves and bunkers where his men could survive the inevitable American bombardment and then emerge to slaughter the Americans in a battle of attrition that would consume resources and lives at a rate that might force American reconsideration of their entire strategic approach. Every cave was connected to multiple others through tunnels that allowed defenders to retreat, reposition, and emerge elsewhere when one position became untenable. Every bunker had pre-sighted fields of fire covering the approaches, with range cards meticulously prepared so that gunners could engage targets they could not see by firing at predetermined points. Every tunnel was ventilated using bamboo pipes and captured electrical equipment to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning and allow defenders to survive deep underground for extended periods. The positions were deep enough to withstand direct hits from battleship shells, with multiple layers of rock and concrete absorbing the shock of explosions that turned the surface into a moonscape. Kuribayashi's men dug 11 miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock using hand tools, mining equipment, and captured construction machinery. They worked in shifts around the clock for 18 months, carving chambers out of solid rock, shoring up ceilings with timber and concrete, creating underground barracks, command posts, hospitals, and ammunition storage facilities. They positioned their artillery in caves with steel doors that could roll back on tracks, allowing the guns to fire and then close again before American counter-battery fire could locate the source. They created firing positions for machine guns and anti-tank weapons that were invisible from more than a few feet away, camouflaged so perfectly that Americans would walk past them repeatedly without seeing them until the positions opened fire. They planted over 23,000 mines across the invasion beaches and the approaches to Suribachi, creating dense minefields that would channel American vehicles into pre-sighted killing zones. They created interlocking fields of fire, where every inch of ground was covered by weapons positioned in multiple locations, ensuring that destroying one firing position would not eliminate the coverage of that area. They stockpiled ammunition, food, and water in quantities sufficient for a prolonged siege. They prepared fighting positions for a final stand in the northern portion of the island, where the terrain was most rugged and defensive advantages were greatest. In his diary, Kuribayashi wrote with grim clarity about what he was building and what he expected to happen. "We shall fight until the last man," he noted. But this was not the usual Japanese rhetoric about glorious death in service to the emperor. Kuribayashi's vision was more terrible and more practical than that. His garrison of 21,000 men would not die quickly in wasteful charges that satisfied martial honor but accomplished nothing. They would die slowly, incrementally, selling American lives at the highest possible price, inflicting maximum casualties over the longest possible time to undermine American will to continue the island-hopping campaign toward the home islands. Every day the Americans spent on Iwo Jima was a day they were not advancing toward Japan. Every casualty was a mother in Iowa or Alabama receiving a telegram, a political cost for the Roosevelt administration, a data point in the calculation of whether the American people would support an invasion of Japan itself. Kuribayashi understood that Japan could not win the war in any conventional sense by early 1945. The combined fleet had been destroyed. The air forces had been decimated. The industrial capacity to replace losses did not exist. But perhaps, if the cost of each island could be made high enough, the Americans could be convinced that invading Japan would be prohibitively expensive in American lives, and a negotiated peace might be possible. This was the strategic logic behind Kuribayashi's defensive plan, and it was not irrational given Japan's strategic situation. It simply failed to account for factors that would prove decisive. Japanese command in Tokyo studied Kuribayashi's defensive plan with the detailed attention it deserved. Staff officers examined maps, studied the underground fortification plans, counted the defensive positions, measured the beaches, and assessed American capabilities based on previous campaigns. They applied the mathematical models that had been developed through the course of the war, models that attempted to predict battle outcomes based on force ratios, terrain advantages, fortification strength, and defender determination. They factored in the lessons from Tarawa, where American forces had taken severe casualties assaulting fortified beaches. They considered Peleliu, where the Japanese had employed similar tunnel defense tactics to devastating effect, holding out far longer than American planners had anticipated. They examined the terrain of Iwo Jima and concluded it was more defensible than either of those previous battles. They counted Kuribayashi's 21,000 defenders and judged them sufficient, given the force multiplier effect of the fortifications. They ran their calculations multiple times, checking their work, ensuring their conclusions were sound. Their final assessment: Iwo Jima could hold out for at least 60 days, probably longer. 2 months of savage attrition that would cost the Americans so dearly they might reconsider their strategy of advancing inexorably toward Japan. The numbers seemed ironclad. The assumptions seemed reasonable. The calculations had the weight of military science behind them. The Americans would need to assault fortified positions across difficult terrain against an enemy who would fight literally to the last man. They would need to clear every bunker, seal every tunnel, eliminate every defended position. The volcanic sand would make movement difficult and provide poor traction for vehicles. The terrain would channel attacks into predictable routes that the defenders had prepared to cover with overwhelming fire. American naval gunfire, while devastating in the open, would be largely ineffective against deeply buried positions. American air superiority meant little when the enemy was underground. The Americans would be forced to take the island the hard way, fighting for every yard with infantry and engineers, clearing positions one by one in close combat, where American material advantages would be minimized. Under these conditions, with determined defenders and superb fortifications, 60 days was a conservative estimate. Some analysts suggested the battle could last 3 months or more. 60 days minimum. The mathematicians and the generals agreed. The emperor himself was informed of this timeline. The entire defensive strategy for the home islands incorporated this 60-day buffer, during which American resources would be consumed and American resolve tested on this miserable volcanic rock that stank of sulfur and death. What Japanese command failed to calculate was something that could not be reduced to numbers on a tactical map or factors in a mathematical model, something that existed in the collective spirit and industrial might of the American military machine in early 1945. They failed to account for the complete totality of America's commitment to winning the war quickly, the overwhelming material superiority that made previous rules of warfare obsolete, and the particular ferocity of the United States Marine Corps when pointed at an objective and told to take it regardless of cost. This was not 1942, when American forces were still learning the basics of amphibious warfare, still building their forces, still figuring out how to fight the Japanese on terms that negated Japanese advantages in jungle fighting and night combat. This was not even 1943, when American forces were competent but still making costly mistakes. This was 1945, and the American war machine had reached its terrible maturity. Every lesson learned at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Palaleo had been studied exhaustively, absorbed into institutional knowledge, and incorporated into revised doctrine that was constantly evolving. The Marines who would hit Iwo Jima's beaches were not the undertrained, under-equipped men who had stumbled ashore at Guadalcanal with limited supplies and no clear understanding of what they faced. These were veterans who had survived previous island campaigns, supplemented by new recruits who had received the best amphibious warfare training in the world. They were supported by the most powerful navy ever assembled, with a concentration of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers that represented more combat power than most nations possessed in their entire military. They were backed by industrial production that seemed almost supernatural in its scale, with factories across America producing weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies in quantities that seemed to violate the laws of economics. And they were driven by a particular American characteristic the Japanese had consistently underestimated throughout the war: the ability to look at a difficult problem and simply overwhelm it with applied violence and material resources used without restraint or conservation. The pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima began on December 8, 1944, and continued intermittently for 74 days before the actual invasion, making it the longest pre-invasion bombardment of any Pacific island. Naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers pounded the island whenever weather permitted. High-altitude bombing by B-24 Liberators and B-29 Superfortresses dropped hundreds of tons of explosives on suspected defensive positions. Carrier aircraft struck at targets identified through aerial reconnaissance and photo analysis. Millions of pounds of explosives rained down on those 8 square miles, turning the surface into a cratered wasteland that resembled photographs of the moon. Trees were stripped of foliage and reduced to splintered stumps. The few buildings that had existed were pulverized into rubble. The volcanic sand was churned and rechurned until the entire surface looked like it had been plowed by giants. The Japanese huddled in their deep tunnels and listened to the world above them disintegrate in a continuous thunder of explosions that went on for days at a time. They waited in darkness, broken only by flickering lamps, breathing air that was hot and stale despite the ventilation systems, and they survived, exactly as Kuribayashi had planned. The tunnels held. The deep bunkers absorbed the punishment. When the bombardment lifted, when the naval guns finally ceased firing and the aircraft departed, Kuribayashi's men would emerge from their underground shelters to find the surface transformed into an alien moonscape. But they would emerge alive and ready to fight. Their weapons were intact. Their ammunition was secure. Their fighting positions, while damaged in some cases, were largely functional. This, too, was part of the calculation. The Japanese had measured American firepower and built their defenses accordingly, going deeper than they thought necessary, adding extra layers of protection, preparing for a bombardment of unprecedented scale and duration. What they had not measured, what they could not measure or predict through mathematical models or rational analysis, was what would come after the firepower stopped. At 06:45 hours on February 19, 1945, the first wave of Marines hit the beach in a carefully choreographed assault that was the product of years of amphibious warfare doctrine development. Landing craft disgorged their human cargo onto volcanic sand that was unlike anything most of the Marines had experienced in previous campaigns. It was not the white coral sand of Tarawa or the coarse yellow sand of other Pacific islands. This was fine black volcanic sand, loose and treacherous, that behaved more like gravel than regular beach sand. Men sank to their ankles immediately, then their calves as they tried to move forward. The sand gave way beneath every step, making forward progress exhausting. Vehicles bogged down almost immediately, their tracks or wheels spinning uselessly in sand that provided no traction. Tanks lurched forward a few yards and then settled into the loose sand, their drivers frantically trying to maintain momentum before the vehicles became hopelessly stuck. The beach rose at a steep 15-degree angle for the first several terraces, making every step forward an exhausting climb through sand that gave way beneath boots and tank treads alike. For the first several minutes, there was almost no resistance. Marines ran forward from the landing craft, spreading out into assault formations, expecting the storm of fire that Japanese defenders had unleashed at other beaches in other campaigns. But the beach was eerily quiet except for the roar of landing craft engines and the shouts of officers and NCOs organizing their men. Some Marines exchanged confused glances, wondering if the bombardment had actually been effective, if perhaps the Japanese garrison had been destroyed or had withdrawn from the beaches. A few allowed themselves the dangerous thought that maybe, just maybe, this one would be easy. Then, at a signal from Kuribayashi's headquarters deep beneath the island's surface, the entire island exploded into coordinated, disciplined violence. Artillery and mortar fire erupted from positions the naval bombardment had barely touched, positions that had been silent and hidden during all the months of reconnaissance and bombardment. Shells began to fall among the Marines with devastating accuracy, because Japanese gunners were firing at pre-sighted coordinates, using range cards that had been prepared months in advance. They did not need to see their targets. They knew exactly where the Americans would be at different stages of the landing, and they had calculated the firing data for every zone of the beach. Machine guns opened up from camouflaged pillboxes that were invisible until they fired. Pillboxes that had been positioned at ground level with firing ports that showed only a few inches above the sand, making them almost impossible to spot from the beach or from offshore. The interlocking fields of fire that Kuribayashi had planned with such care now revealed their lethal geometry. Every position could cover the blind spots of every other position. Every inch of the beach was covered by fire from multiple directions. The killing zones Kuribayashi had so carefully prepared began to fill with American casualties. Men fell in windows, cut down by fire coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Radios crackled with urgent calls for corpsmen, for supporting fire, for help. The volcanic sand, black to begin with, began to turn darker and wetter in spreading patches as American blood soaked into it. Landing craft tried to turn back and struck mines that blew their ramps off, killing or wounding everyone inside in showers of steel fragments and splintered wood. Other landing craft hit mines on their approaches and exploded in geysers of water and debris. Tanks that had managed to get off the beach and up the first terrace threw tracks in the soft sand and became stationary targets for Japanese anti-tank gunners who had been waiting patiently for vehicles to present themselves. Some tanks brewed up immediately as armor-piercing rounds found ammunition or fuel. Others were immobilized and had to be abandoned by their crews under fire. The first hour of the battle was a nightmare of confusion, casualties, and grinding forward motion through a landscape that seemed designed by a sadistic intelligence specifically to maximize American suffering. Everything that could go wrong seemed to be going wrong simultaneously. Communications were disrupted by the volcanic sand getting into equipment. Unit cohesion broke down as casualties mounted, and men became separated from their squads and platoons. The steep terraces of loose sand created dead spaces where Marines could not see more than a few yards in any direction, making it impossible to get a sense of the overall situation. Officers and NCOs tried to maintain control and keep their men moving forward, but the combination of terrain, casualties, and enemy fire made organization almost impossible in the chaos of the initial landing. But the Marines did not stop. They did not retreat to the beach and wait for the situation to stabilize. They moved forward because forward was the only direction that mattered, the only direction that led to accomplishing the mission. This was not courage in some abstract heroic sense, though courage was certainly present in abundance. This was training, discipline, and institutional culture asserting itself under conditions of extreme stress. The Marines had been taught that, when you hit a defended beach, you move forward immediately, because staying on the beach means dying on the beach. The beach is the killing zone. The only way out is forward, through the enemy, to take the positions that are firing at you and eliminate them. So they moved forward through volcanic sand that clutched at their boots, and through fire that killed them in terrible numbers. But they moved forward. Flamethrower teams crawled within range of bunkers, often losing half their members in the approach, and sent jets of liquid fire into firing ports, cooking alive the Japanese inside. Demolition teams rushed pillboxes with satchel charges, suffering appalling casualties but destroying the positions before the next wave came forward. Naval gunfire shifted to support the advance once shore fire control parties established communications, with battleship shells screaming overhead to impact on Japanese positions identified by spotters who were themselves under fire. Close air support appeared overhead, Corsairs and Hellcats diving through, anti-aircraft fire to strafe and rocket anything that looked like a defensive position or suspected artillery location. The American military machine was not elegant in its application of violence. It was not surgical or precise. It was comprehensive, overwhelming, and utterly relentless. Where one Marine fell, two more came forward from the waves of reinforcements that continued to land despite the casualties. Where one tank was disabled, three more arrived on the beach in the next wave. And if they too were disabled, three more would arrive after that. The industrial capacity that Kurebayashi had observed during his time in America now revealed itself in its full terrible efficiency on the beaches of Iwo Jima. The Americans were not fighting with what they had brought with them in some finite sense. They were fighting with everything they could bring to bear from an industrial base that was effectively unlimited compared to the static garrison defending the island. For every weapon the Japanese had, the Americans had 10. For every shell the Japanese fired, the Americans fired 100. For every man the Japanese could commit, the Americans could commit 5. And the Americans were willing to use all of it, to expend resources at rates that seemed wasteful by the standards of any other military, but which made perfect sense given American industrial capacity and strategic priorities. By nightfall on the first day, February 19, 1945, approximately 30,000 Marines were ashore on Iwo Jima. They held a beachhead 4,000 yards wide, but only 700 yards deep at its furthest point of penetration. They had suffered approximately 2,400 casualties, including 519 dead, and the rest wounded to varying degrees of severity. The beaches were littered with destroyed and disabled equipment, tanks with blown tracks, Amtraks that had hit mines, landing craft that had been shot to pieces, vehicles that had bogged down in the sand and been abandoned. Smoke from burning vehicles mixed with the sulfurous stench that gave the island its name, creating a toxic atmosphere that burned lungs and eyes. Japanese command received reports of the landing and calculated that this rate of American casualties, if sustained throughout the battle, would indeed fulfill the prediction of a 2-month campaign. The Americans had lost 2,400 men on the first day. Project that forward for 60 days, and the total American casualties would exceed 100,000, a number so catastrophic it might indeed force strategic recalculation. The plan was working. The fortifications were holding. The Americans were paying in blood for every yard of volcanic sand. The mathematics seemed to be validating Japanese predictions. Except, the plan was already falling, apart at a level Japanese command could not see from their distant headquarters in Tokyo. The plan assumed that the rate of American casualties would slow American momentum, that taking such losses would force the Americans to pause, consolidate, bring up reinforcements, reconsider their approach. This assumption was fundamentally wrong, because it was based on Japanese understanding of how military forces normally responded to casualties. In Japanese military culture, taking heavy casualties in an initial assault typically meant the attack had failed and needed to be reconsidered or reinforced before continuing. Units that had been bloodied needed time to recover, reorganize, and restore their combat effectiveness. This was standard military practice across most armies throughout history. But the Americans were not operating according to standard military practice. The Marines had developed a different philosophy through bitter experience in the Pacific, a philosophy that was counterintuitive but brutally effective. The Marines had learned that when fighting the Japanese, you did not slow down when casualties mounted. You accelerated. You pressed forward harder because every hour the Japanese remained organized, and in prepared positions was an hour they could inflict more casualties. The Japanese would fight to the death regardless of circumstances. This was not propaganda. This was documented fact from every previous island campaign. If the defenders were going to die anyway, the only variable the Americans controlled was the timeline. Take the island fast enough, and you controlled the timetable, you dictated the terms of combat, you forced the Japanese to react instead of fighting from prepared positions. Let it drag out, and you fought on the enemy's terms, bleeding for every yard in a war of attrition that favored the defender. So the Marines pressed forward into terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god specifically to kill them. They pressed forward up the slopes of Suribachi, through the central plains toward the airfields, toward the northern ridges where the worst fighting still awaited. They pressed forward through artillery fire that turned volcanic sand into deadly shrapnel, through mortar fire that seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, through machine gun fire from positions they often never saw until they were inside the bunker fighting, hand to hand in darkness that stank of sulfur and death and cordite and the particular smell of burned human flesh. On the second day, February 20th, the Marines began the assault on Mount Suribachi in earnest. The volcano dominated the southern end of the island, and from its heights, Japanese artillery observers could direct fire across the entire landing beach and the southern portion of the island. Every Marine on the beach was under observation from Suribachi. Every movement could be seen and targeted. Taking the mountain was essential to securing the beachhead and allowing supplies and reinforcements to flow ashore without suffering constant casualties from observed artillery fire. The 28th Marine Regiment was given the mission of taking Suribachi, and they began fighting their way up the slopes through some of the most dense fortifications on the island. Every cave was a fortress. Every rocky outcropping concealed firing positions. The Japanese had spent months preparing Suribachi's defenses, and they intended to make the Americans pay for every foot of elevation. The fighting was close and brutal. Flamethrowers became the primary weapon for reducing bunkers. Demolition teams sealed caves with explosives after grenades, and small arms fire failed to neutralize the defenders inside. Artillery and naval gunfire pounded suspected positions ahead of the advancing Marines. The progress was measured in yards per hour, paid for in casualties that mounted with each push forward. On the third day, February 21st, the Marines continued grinding toward Suribachi's summit, while other units pushed north toward the airfields. The central plateau of the island was relatively flat, but completely exposed to fire from high ground on the flanks. Advancing across open ground under observed fire was nearly suicidal, but the Marines did it anyway because it had to be done. They moved forward in small groups, using craters and wreckage for cover, calling in supporting fire on any position that revealed itself by firing. Japanese defenders emerged from tunnels to fire at the Americans and then disappeared back underground before counterfire could eliminate them. It was like fighting ghosts, fighting an enemy who could appear anywhere and disappear just as quickly. The tunnel system Kuribayashi had built was proving its worth, allowing defenders to retreat from untenable positions and reappear elsewhere to continue fighting. But the tunnels also became tombs when Americans found the entrances and pumped them full of flamethrower fuel or sealed them with explosives, trapping defenders inside to suffocate or die of dehydration in the darkness below. On the fourth day, February 23rd, a patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, reached the summit of Mount Suribachi after 3 days of vicious fighting up the slopes. They carried with them a small American flag, 54 by 28 inches, taken from a ship offshore. At 10:20 hours, they raised the flag on a length of Japanese pipe they found near the summit, and the entire southern end of the island erupted in cheers that could be heard over the sound of ongoing combat. Ships offshore sounded their horns and sirens in a cacophony of celebration. Marines fighting on the beaches and in the Central Plains looked up and saw the flag, and understood that the mountain that had dominated the battlefield, the terrain feature from which Japanese artillery observers had directed so much death, was now American. The psychological impact was enormous. The physical impact was equally significant. With Suribachi in American hands, the entire southern portion of the island was now under American observation. Japanese positions could be spotted and targeted. The beaches were no longer under direct observation from Japanese observers. Supplies could flow ashore more freely. The entire complexion of the battle shifted in that moment. A few hours later, at 14:30 hours, a larger flag was carried up the mountain to replace the first. This flag measured 96 by 56 inches, visible from much greater distances. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson wanted a flag large enough that every man on the island and every ship offshore could see it clearly. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had climbed Suribachi hoping to photograph something interesting, captured the moment of the second flag raising. 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman struggled against the wind to raise the heavy flag on a longer pole. Rosenthal's photograph, taken at the exact moment the flag was going up, would become the most reproduced image in photographic history, a symbol of American determination and sacrifice that transcended the specific battle. The photograph would appear on posters, stamps, and eventually as the basis for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. But in the moment, on the ground, with combat still raging across the rest of the island, the flag meant something more immediate and visceral than symbolism. It meant Suribachi had fallen in 4 days. 4 days to take a mountain that Japanese command had expected to hold for a week or more. A mountain so heavily fortified that conventional military analysis suggested it might take 2 weeks to reduce through siege and bombardment. The mathematics were not working. Japanese headquarters in Tokyo examined the reports coming from Iwo Jima with growing confusion that slowly turned to alarm. The Americans should have been bogged down by now. The casualties should have slowed their advance to a crawl. The terrain, the fortifications, the fanatical resistance of defenders who were fighting to the death as ordered. All of it should have been enough to stall the American advance and force them into a grinding war of attrition. But the Americans kept coming. Where Japanese doctrine and experience said a fortified position should hold for 24 hours, it held for 6 or 8 hours before being overrun. Where the defensive plan anticipated Americans would need a week to capture a particular objective, they needed 2 or 3 days. The rate of advance was faster than anything Japanese planning had anticipated. Faster than anything mathematical models suggested was possible, given the strength of fortifications and the determination of defenders. Yet it was happening. Reports arrived continuously showing American progress that exceeded predictions by wider margins each day. Something was wrong with the fundamental assumptions underlying the defensive plan. But from Tokyo, it was difficult to understand exactly what was wrong. What was wrong was that the Americans were not fighting the way wars were supposed to be fought according to conventional military analysis and historical precedent. They were not conserving resources or carefully husbanding their forces for a protracted campaign. They were not rotating units out of combat to rest and refit before committing them again. They were not pausing to consolidate gains before pushing forward. They were attacking continuously, day and night, with every available resource, accepting casualties that would have caused other militaries to pause and reconsider. They were throwing everything they had at every objective simultaneously, and they seemed to have inexhaustible reserves of everything. Men, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, vehicles, weapons. The Americans fought as if scarcity did not exist, because for them, in this battle, it effectively did not exist. The supply line stretched back across the Pacific to the American West Coast and ultimately to the industrial heartland of America, where factories worked 24 hours a day, producing everything the military needed. That supply line was protected by naval and air superiority so complete that Japanese forces could not seriously threaten it. The Americans could expend resources at rates that seemed insane by Japanese standards because those resources would be replaced faster than they could be consumed. A Japanese soldier named Tsurugi Akikusa, who survived the battle by being knocked unconscious and left for dead in a collapsed tunnel, later wrote about his experience and his growing realization of what American abundance meant in practical terms. We had been told by our officers that American soldiers were soft, that they loved comfort and luxury and would not endure hardship or sacrifice, he wrote, in a memoir published decades after the war. But what we saw on Iwo Jima was not softness. It was something more frightening than toughness or determination. The Americans had not become hard men who could endure privation. They had eliminated privation. They fought surrounded by abundance. When we ran out of ammunition for our machine guns, we fought with rifles. When we ran out of rifle ammunition, we fought with bayonets or grenades. When we ran out of everything, we died. When the Americans ran out of machine gun ammunition, more arrived within an hour on supply vehicles that somehow navigated the terrible terrain. When they ran out of rifle ammunition, helicopters or supply parties brought cases of it forward. When they ran out of food, they had rations dropped by parachute or brought forward by supply units. They had fresh water in abundance from desalination equipment on their ships, while we rationed our canteens and eventually drank our own urine. They had medical evacuation by helicopter to hospital ships, where surgeons could operate in clean, well-equipped facilities. We had nothing. Our wounded crawled into caves to die because we had no medicine, no bandages, no hope of evacuation. The Americans did not defeat us through superior spirit or superior tactics. They defeated us through superior abundance. They could not be killed fast enough to matter because more always came. They could not be starved or worn down because they had everything they needed in quantities that seemed magical. This abundance manifested in ways both large and small that Japanese defenders found almost incomprehensible when they had opportunities to observe it. American corpsmen could call for medical evacuation, and helicopters would arrive within minutes to carry wounded men back to hospital ships offshore where surgical theaters operated continuously with full staffs of doctors, nurses, and equipment. Japanese wounded crawled into caves to die slowly of their wounds because they had no morphine to ease the pain, no antibiotics to fight infection, no possibility of surgery or proper medical care. American tanks that threw tracks or suffered mechanical breakdowns were repaired by maintenance teams that arrived with full toolkits and stocks of spare parts. Disabled tanks were recovered by specialized vehicles and towed to rear areas for repair. Japanese tanks, the few they had on the island, became permanent pillboxes once they were damaged because there were no spare parts, no mechanics with proper tools, no logistics system capable of supporting armored vehicle maintenance. When American artillery units ran low on ammunition, fire support ships offshore could unload tens of thousands of rounds and have them transported to firing batteries within a day. When Japanese artillery ran low on shells, there was no resupply at all because the Americans controlled the sea approaches completely, and no supply submarines or ships could reach the island. The fighting men on both sides were brave. The casualties on both sides were horrific, but one side was fighting with the full industrial might of the most productive economy in human history behind them, and the other side was fighting with whatever they had managed to stockpile before the battle began. And no amount of courage or determination could bridge that material gap indefinitely. The Bushido spirit, the willingness to die for the emperor, the samurai tradition of preferring death to surrender. None of it mattered against an enemy who could replace every loss and continue attacking with undiminished strength while the defenders grew weaker with every man lost, every round fired, every day that passed without resupply or reinforcement. The fighting men on both sides were brave. The casualties on both sides were horrific, but one side was fighting with the full industrial might of the most productive economy in human history behind them, and the other side was fighting with whatever they had managed to stockpile before the battle began. And no amount of courage or determination could bridge that material gap indefinitely. The Bushido spirit, the willingness to die for the emperor, the samurai tradition of preferring death to surrender. None of it mattered against an enemy who could replace every loss and continue attacking with undiminished strength while the defenders grew weaker with every man lost, every round fired, every day that passed without resupply or reinforcement. By the end of the first week, February 26th, the Marines controlled the southern third of the island, including Mount Suribachi and Airfield No. 1, the southernmost of the island's 3 airfields. Engineers and Seabees were already working on repairing and extending the runway, even as fighting continued in other parts of the island. Japanese command recalculated their estimates based on the rate of American progress. Perhaps not 60 days as originally predicted, perhaps 45 or 50 days. The Americans were moving faster than expected, but they were taking casualties. The casualty ratio was still favorable to the defense. Every American killed or wounded was a small victory. If the battle lasted 6 weeks instead of 8, that was still a substantial achievement, still a demonstration that the home islands could be defended. Still a message to American planners that invading Japan would be prohibitively costly. The revised estimates were communicated to Tokyo with reassurances that the defense was proceeding according to the fundamental plan, even if some timelines needed adjustment. The northern portion of the island, where Kuribayashi had concentrated his strongest defenses in a wilderness of ravines and ridges, would slow the Americans. The terrain there was the most difficult on the island. That terrain would compensate for the faster-than-expected American progress in the south. Surely that terrain would slow them. The analysts and generals convinced themselves this was true because the alternative was too grim to contemplate. And the terrain did slow the Americans. The northern portion of Iwo Jima was a nightmare landscape that would give names to specific terrain features that would haunt Marine veterans for the rest of their lives. The Meat Grinder, Turkey Knob, the Amphitheater, Hill 382. These were not hills in any normal sense. They were jumbles of volcanic rock cut through with ravines and sharp ridges that channeled movement into predictable paths covered by Japanese fire. Every ridge had machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. Every ravine was pre-sighted by mortars. Every cave system had multiple entrances and exits allowing defenders to fire and then disappear before they could be targeted effectively. The Marines ground forward through some of the most vicious close-quarters combat of the entire Pacific War. Every ridge had to be taken yard by yard with flamethrowers and explosives. Every cave had to be cleared by Marines crawling into darkness with grenades and submachine guns, not knowing what waited inside. Every bunker cost American lives, even when it was eventually destroyed. The advances here were measured in hundreds of yards per day instead of thousands. Units that had already taken significant casualties in the fighting for Suribachi and the airfields now found themselves fighting through terrain that was objectively worse with an enemy that was just as determined and better positioned. But the Americans kept coming. The 4th Marine Division attacked from the east. The 5th Marine Division attacked from the west. The 3rd Marine Division, originally held in floating reserve offshore, was committed to the center of the line when casualties and the difficulty of terrain made it clear that fresh troops were needed. The Americans could rotate units, pull exhausted battalions out of the line, and replace them with fresh battalions, allow units to rest for a day or two before sending them back into combat. The Japanese fought until they died in whatever position they held. There was no rotation, no relief, no rest. Defenders who had been fighting continuously for 2 weeks were still in their positions firing at Americans and throwing grenades and fighting hand-to-hand when bunkers were breached. The cumulative effects of continuous combat without rest, diminishing supplies of food and water, no reinforcement of casualties, and the psychological toll of knowing there was no hope of relief or rescue began to tell on even the most determined defenders. By March 10th, 3 weeks after the invasion began, American forces had pressed Japanese defenders into a final pocket less than 1,000 yards square at the northern tip of the island. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were still alive in the tunnel networks, but they were cut off from each other, running out of supplies and facing certain death. Some continued fighting with fanatical determination. Others, their spirit broken by continuous combat and the hopelessness of their situation, killed themselves with grenades rather than face the Americans. Kuribayashi sent his final messages to Tokyo, reporting that the defense was continuing, but that American progress was exceeding all predictions. He did not explicitly state that the defense would collapse within days, but the implications were clear to anyone reading the reports. The island was lost. The 2-month defense had lasted 3 weeks. The entire strategic calculation had been wrong. On March 16, 1945, the island was declared secure by American commanders. 26 days from the initial landing to the declaration of security. 26 days to take an island Japanese command had calculated would hold for at least 60 days. Less than half the expected time. Less than half the timeline that was supposed to grind down American will and consume American resources at rates that would force strategic recalculation. The Marines had taken approximately 26,000 casualties in those 26 days, including nearly 7,000 dead, making Iwo Jima the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, measured by casualty rate. 1 in 3 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima was killed or wounded. The 28th Marine Regiment that took Suribachi suffered 400% casualties, meaning the unit was completely replaced 4 times over during the fighting. Individual companies were wiped out and rebuilt multiple times. The Medal of Honor was awarded to 27 Marines and Navy corpsmen for actions on Iwo Jima, more than had been awarded for any single battle in American history. The cost in blood and suffering was enormous. The victory was soaked in blood and purchased with staggering sacrifice that would echo through families and communities across America for generations. But it was a victory achieved in less than half the time the defenders had believed possible, and that difference, that gap between what Japanese command expected and what American forces delivered, was more strategically significant than the casualty numbers or the yards of terrain captured. It represented a fundamental miscalculation about what the American military was capable of when fully committed to an objective with all the resources of American industrial might supporting the fighting men. Japanese defensive planning had been excellent. The fortifications had been superb. The courage of the defenders had been beyond question. None of it had been enough. The perfect defense could not hold against imperfect offense, backed by overwhelming material superiority and institutional willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of quick victory. The Japanese had calculated what was possible based on historical precedent, conventional military mathematics, and rational analysis of relative capabilities. The Americans had rendered those calculations obsolete through the simple expedient of bringing more of everything than the defense was designed to handle and using it all without restraint or concern for conservation. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only 216 were captured alive, most of them wounded or unconscious when taken. The rest died in their tunnels and bunkers, fighting to the last, as Kuribayashi had ordered. Many killed themselves when capture appeared inevitable. The suicide rate among Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima was extraordinarily high even by Pacific War standards. Men detonated grenades against their own bodies. Officers committed ritual seppuku in their command posts. Groups of soldiers made final banzai charges not to achieve tactical objectives, but simply to die fighting, rather than in the darkness of sealed caves. Kuribayashi himself disappeared in late March, probably killed in a final attack or possibly committing suicide, though his body was never positively identified. He had built the most sophisticated defensive system in the Pacific War. He had led his men with intelligence, courage, and a realistic understanding of what they faced. None of it was enough. The perfect defense had been overwhelmed by the imperfect but utterly overwhelming American offense. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff examined the results of Iwo Jima with emotions that ranged from shock to denial to grim acceptance of what it meant for the future. How had the Americans done it? How had they overcome fortifications that represented the pinnacle of defensive engineering in less than half the expected time? The analysts studied the reports obsessively, searching for answers. They identified the material factors, the naval gunfire that never ceased, the air superiority that allowed close air support at all times, the abundance of supplies that meant American forces never had to slow down due to logistical constraints. But these were symptoms of a larger reality that was difficult for Japanese military culture to fully grasp. The Americans had approached the battle with a fundamentally different philosophy about the relationship between casualties and operational tempo. Japanese military culture, like most military cultures throughout history, viewed casualties as a constraint on operations. If you took heavy casualties assaulting a position, you paused to regroup, brought up reinforcements, reconsidered your approach. Casualties slowed you down because your force was weakened and needed time to recover combat effectiveness. This was rational military thinking based on centuries of warfare. The Americans, through bitter experience in the Pacific, had developed a counterintuitive approach. They viewed the inevitable casualties as a reason to accelerate rather than pause. If the enemy was going to fight to the death anyway, and if you had the resources to sustain continuous operations despite casualties, then the fastest path to minimizing total casualties was to end the battle as quickly as possible. Accept higher casualties in the short term to achieve victory faster and reduce total casualties over the course of the battle. This logic only worked if you had unlimited resources relative to the operational requirements. And in the Pacific in 1945, the Americans effectively did have unlimited resources compared to isolated Japanese island garrisons. So they attacked continuously, replaced casualties immediately, sustained operational tempo regardless of losses, and ended battles in half the time conventional military wisdom said was possible. The Japanese analysts struggled with this concept because it violated their understanding of how military operations worked. To them, it looked like the Americans were simply willing to accept unlimited casualties. That American disregard for casualties was what enabled the fast victories. This interpretation was incorrect. The Americans cared deeply about casualties, which is precisely why they tried to end battles quickly. But the subtle distinction between accepting casualties to achieve speed versus being indifferent to casualties was lost in the analysis. Japanese command concluded that American willingness to accept casualties was effectively unlimited, that public opinion in America would support any level of losses in pursuit of victory. This conclusion was wrong, but it shaped Japanese strategic planning for the defense of Okinawa and potentially the home islands. If the Americans would accept unlimited casualties, then the Japanese strategy had to shift toward making each battle so costly that the cumulative effect would eventually break American will, even if individual battles could not be won. This was the path toward the suicidal defense of Okinawa and the planning for Operation Katsugo, the defense of the Japanese home islands. The transformation of Iwo Jima from battlefield to operational airbase began even before the fighting ended. Navy Seabees, the construction battalions that had proven their worth throughout the Pacific War, moved onto the island immediately behind the advancing Marines. They began repairing damaged runways, extending them, installing navigation equipment, and building the infrastructure needed to support major air operations. The work continued under fire. Seabees were killed and wounded by Japanese artillery and mortars while grading runways and operating heavy equipment. They worked around the clock because every day the airfield remained non-operational. Was another day B-29s had to fly unescorted to Japan, and another day crippled bombers had to ditch in the Pacific. Instead of landing safely on March 4th, while fighting still raged in the northern two-thirds of the island, a B-29 superfortress named Dynamite made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima's Airfield No. 1. The bomber had been damaged during a raid on Tokyo and could not maintain altitude for the return flight to Saipan. Instead of ditching in the Pacific with uncertain chances of rescue, the crew landed on Iwo Jima, where the runway had just been declared operational. The 11-man crew survived because Iwo Jima existed as an American airbase. They were the first of 2,400 B-29s, and more than 27,000 airmen who would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima before the war ended. Every one of those crews represented American lives saved. American sons and fathers and brothers who came home because the Marines had taken the island. The strategic calculation that had made the battle necessary was vindicated by every bomber crew that landed safely instead of ditching in the Pacific where rescue was uncertain, at best even with air-sea rescue operations. P-51 Mustang fighters began operating from Iwo Jima in March, escorting B-29s all the way to Japan and back. The presence of fighters dramatically reduced bomber losses to Japanese interceptors and allowed the bombing campaign to intensify. Missions that had been prohibitively dangerous became routine. The noose around Japan tightened. By April, hundreds of aircraft were operating from Iwo Jima daily. The island that had been a Japanese base threatening American operations became an American base that helped seal Japan's fate. The strategic transformation was complete. In the years and decades after the war, historians and veterans debated whether Iwo Jima was necessary, whether the casualties were justified, whether alternative strategies might have achieved the same results with fewer losses. Some argued the island could have been bypassed and isolated, that its fall was inevitable once Japan lost the war, and therefore the lives spent taking it were wasted. Others countered that the lives saved through emergency landings alone justified the battle, that the escort fighters based there significantly reduced casualties among bomber crews, that the psychological impact of the flag-raising photograph was worth something in maintaining American morale. The debates continued for generations, without reaching consensus because the counterfactual question of what would have happened without Iwo Jima could never be definitively answered. But none of those debates changed what the battle demonstrated about the American military at the peak of its World War II power. It demonstrated capacity, the ability to project overwhelming force across the largest ocean on Earth and sustain complex operations indefinitely. It demonstrated flexibility, the ability to adapt tactics to terrain and enemy defenses in real time without losing operational momentum. It demonstrated institutional courage, the willingness of American political and military leadership to accept horrific casualties in pursuit of objectives deemed strategically necessary. And most fundamentally, it demonstrated that American industrial abundance translated directly and decisively into military effectiveness. The Marines who took Iwo Jima did not win through superior individual martial spirit, though they possessed courage in abundance. They did not win through tactical brilliance, though their tactics were sound and constantly improving. They won because behind them stood an industrial nation fully mobilized for total war, a nation that could produce more ships, planes, tanks, guns, ammunition, and supplies than the enemy could ever hope to destroy. A nation that treated its fighting forces as valuable enough to support with every resource available, without restraint or conservation. The photograph Joe Rosenthal took of the flag raising on Suribachi became one of the most iconic images in American history, reproduced millions of times, adapted into posters and stamps, eventually immortalized in bronze as the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. The image captured something essential about American identity in that era: collective effort toward a common goal, determination in the face of difficulty, the raising of the flag as a symbol of achievement and sacrifice. The 6 men in the photograph became famous, though 3 of them died on Iwo Jima before the battle ended and never knew their image had become immortal. The photograph was used to sell war bonds, to maintain morale, to symbolize American military success. It became detached from the specific context of Iwo Jima and became a symbol of American military service in general. But the deeper truth of Iwo Jima, the truth that mattered strategically and historically, was not captured in that single frozen moment of 6 men raising a flag. The deeper truth was in the thousands of individual moments of Marines advancing under fire when every instinct screamed to take cover. The truth was in corpsmen treating wounded under artillery bombardment, exposing themselves to enemy fire to save lives. The truth was in engineers and Seabees repairing runways while combat still raged nearby, working with the knowledge that artillery could land on them at any moment. The truth was in the entire massive apparatus of American military power functioning at maximum capacity to take an island that was supposed to take twice as long to fall according to the enemy's calculations. The flag on Suribachi was a symbol, powerful and meaningful, but the speed with which it got there, the relentless advance that put Marines on top of that mountain in 4 days when the enemy expected a week or more, that was the substance of American military effectiveness in 1945. For the Empire of Japan, Iwo Jima was one more brutal lesson in a curriculum of defeat that had been teaching the same fundamental truths since Midway. The Americans could not be outlasted. They could not be bled enough to matter in the strategic sense. Every fortified island that was supposed to hold for months fell in weeks. Every defensive line that was supposed to be impregnable was penetrated. Every calculation based on historical precedent and conventional military wisdom proved obsolete when applied against an enemy who did not fight conventionally because they did not have to. An enemy with 50 times your industrial capacity does not need to fight fair or employ elegant tactics or conserve resources. They can simply overwhelm. They can bring more of everything than you can possibly handle and use it all without concern for efficiency or conservation. And that is what the Americans did, battle after battle, island after island, until there was nowhere left to retreat to, and surrender became the only alternative to complete annihilation. The Japanese soldiers who died on Iwo Jima died bravely, following their orders, true to their code. They deserved respect as warriors, regardless of the cause they served. But their bravery accomplished nothing in the strategic sense because bravery alone without the industrial and material capacity to sustain it, was insufficient against an enemy like America in 1945. The Bushido spirit, the samurai tradition, the willingness to die for the emperor. These were real and meaningful to the men who embodied them, but they did not translate into military effectiveness against an enemy who possessed overwhelming material advantages and the strategic philosophy to exploit those advantages without restraint. The Marines who survived Iwo Jima carried the island with them for the rest of their lives, in ways both visible and invisible. The volcanic sand had gotten into everything during the battle. Clothes, weapons, food, wounds, and some claimed they could still smell the sulfur decades later, that the scent would trigger flashbacks to specific moments of combat. The faces of friends who had died in that black sand haunted dreams and waking thoughts. The specific sounds of combat on Iwo Jima, the whistle of incoming mortar rounds, the crack of Japanese rifles, the whoosh of flamethrowers, the screams of wounded men became permanent memories that could be triggered by unrelated stimuli decades later. Post-traumatic stress was not well understood in 1945, and veterans were expected to simply readjust to civilian life without much support. Many struggled with depression, anxiety, anger, and other psychological effects of sustained combat. The VA hospitals treated physical wounds but largely ignored psychological ones. Veterans formed their own support networks, gathering at reunions where they could talk with men who understood what they had experienced without needing explanation. But the survivors also carried pride. They had done what they were asked to do under conditions of extreme difficulty and danger. They had taken an island that the enemy believed was impregnable. They had done it faster than anyone except themselves believed possible. They had paid a terrible price measured in friends killed and wounded, in physical and psychological scars that would last lifetimes. But they had achieved the objective. The mission was accomplished. The airfields were captured. The B-29s landed safely. The fighters escorted bombers to Japan. The strategic purpose was fulfilled. In the simple moral calculus that sustained combat veterans, this mattered. The cost had been high, but the cost would have been paid somewhere else, if not on Iwo Jima. The only question was whether the cost purchased something of value. The veterans believed it had. The 27,000 airmen who landed safely on Iwo Jima during the war certainly believed it had. The mathematical cost-benefit analysis of Iwo Jima is something historians can debate, with spreadsheets and models and counterfactual scenarios. The men who fought there dealt in simpler mathematics. They were given a mission. They completed it. The price was high, but the mission was accomplished. That was the only calculation that ultimately mattered to them. In the end, what Japanese command could not believe, what their careful calculations and rational analysis had failed to predict, was not that American Marines were brave or skilled or determined. Japanese soldiers possessed all those qualities in equal measure. What Japanese command could not believe was the complete totality of American material superiority and the strategic philosophy that guided its application. The Americans did not try to fight efficiently in the conventional sense of minimizing resource expenditure. They fought overwhelmingly, bringing maximum force to bear against every objective without regard for conservation of resources, because they did not need to conserve anything. They had more. They always had more. More men to replace casualties, more ammunition to fire without counting rounds, more ships to bring supplies, more planes to provide support, more of everything that mattered in industrial warfare. And they were willing to use all of it to win quickly, rather than dragging out battles in some misguided attempt to minimize short-term casualties while accepting longer battles that would ultimately cost more lives. The strategy was brutal in its simplicity. It was effective in its results. And it worked because the United States in 1945 was the most powerful military-industrial force the world had ever seen up to that point in history. And Iwo Jima was a demonstration of what that force could accomplish when pointed at a target and told to take it quickly regardless of cost. The Japanese had built the perfect defense using all their engineering skill and tactical knowledge. The Americans had brought more offense than the perfect defense was built to handle. The mathematical equation was that simple and that terrible. Superior numbers plus superior material plus institutional willingness to use both without restraint equals victory, regardless of the quality of enemy defenses. This was the lesson of Iwo Jima, written in blood and volcanic sand. illustrated by the flag on Suribachi that flew weeks before the enemy's calculations said it could possibly fly. The sun set on March 26, 1945, over an island that had been utterly transformed from Japanese fortress to American airbase in exactly 36 days from first landing to final mop-up operations. The volcanic sand was churned into a moonscape of craters and wreckage. The elaborate tunnel systems were sealed with explosives or cleared of defenders and repurposed for American use. The dead were buried in temporary cemeteries that would later be relocated. Japanese dead in mass graves and American dead with markers that would eventually be moved to permanent cemeteries or returned home to families. The airfields were fully operational with dozens of aircraft parked on tarmacs and more arriving daily. Engineers were already planning expansions and improvements. What was supposed to take at least 2 months had taken less than 4 weeks of sustained combat. The mathematics had been comprehensively wrong. The calculations had failed to account for the one variable that could not be quantified on a planning map or expressed in a mathematical model. The full weight of American industrial power applied without restraint to a single objective with institutional commitment to achieving that objective as quickly as possible regardless of the cost in resources or lives. Japanese command in Tokyo had built their entire defensive strategy on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. They had assumed American casualties would slow American momentum. They had assumed American resources, while greater than Japanese resources, were still finite enough that conservation and efficiency would constrain American operations. They had assumed that traditional military logic about force ratios and defensive advantages would apply. They had been wrong on all counts. The Americans did not slow down when casualties mounted. American resources were effectively unlimited for the purposes of any single operation. Traditional military logic did not apply when one side possessed such overwhelming material superiority that they could simply overwhelm defenses through sheer application of force. These lessons should have been obvious from previous campaigns. But Japanese command had convinced themselves that Iwo Jima was different, that the fortifications were better, that the defenders were more determined. The 2 months was a conservative estimate. They were wrong. The island fell in half that time. The perfect defense had been overwhelmed by imperfect but overwhelming offense, backed by industrial capacity that Japanese planners had failed to adequately factor into their calculations. Years later, American historians would debate whether the specific tactics employed on Iwo Jima were optimal, whether different approaches might have achieved the same results with fewer casualties. These debates were academic exercises that missed the fundamental point. The tactics were adequate. The strategy was sound. But what won the battle was not tactical brilliance or strategic genius. What won the battle was the massive application of American industrial power to support fighting men who were brave and determined and willing to do what needed to be done. The combination of human courage and material abundance, individual determination and institutional support, tactical aggression, and unlimited logistics. That was what took Iwo Jima in 26 days, when the enemy believed 60 days was optimistic. The flag Joe Rosenthal photographed flying from the summit of Suribachi became an enduring symbol because it captured something true about America in that moment of history. Not just military power, though that was certainly present. Not just courage, though the Marines displayed that in abundance. The flag represented the culmination of years of mobilization, of factories running 3 shifts, of women working jobs previously reserved for men, of rationing and war bonds and collective national sacrifice. It represented a democracy that had chosen total war and then prosecuted that war with industrial efficiency that turned American productive capacity into military effectiveness. The 6 men raising that flag were not special in the sense of being uniquely brave or capable. They were representative of hundreds of thousands of other men doing similar things on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific. What made them powerful as warriors was not their individual qualities, though those mattered. What made them powerful was the entire American system standing behind them. The factories producing their weapons, the ships delivering their supplies, the medical system treating their wounds, the replacement system filling casualties. The the strategic vision that gave their sacrifices purpose and meaning. This was what Japanese command could not believe, even as the evidence mounted that it was true. This was what their calculations had failed to capture. Military power in the industrial age was not primarily about individual warrior spirit or tactical brilliance or even numerical superiority in a simple sense. It was about the complete system: industrial, logistical, medical, replacement, strategic, that supported the fighting men at the point of contact. The Japanese had focused on building an impregnable defense and instilling unbreakable spirit in their defenders. The Americans had built a system that could overwhelm any defense and sustain any level of casualties necessary to achieve strategic objectives. The Bushido spirit versus the industrial system. The result was never in doubt once the battle began. Though neither side understood that clearly during the fighting, Iwo Jima fell in half the predicted time because predictions based on traditional military analysis were obsolete when applied to America. In 1945, the Americans had changed the fundamental rules of warfare through industrial capacity that translated directly into military effectiveness. They could lose more men and equipment in a week than some nations possessed in total. And they could replace those losses faster than they occurred and continue attacking without pause. This was not sustainable for most nations. It was easily sustainable for America. And that difference, that massive gap in national capability, decided the battle before the first Marine landed on that volcanic sand beach. The island that was supposed to hold for 2 months fell in 4 weeks. Japanese command could not believe it, even as their last radio messages from Kuribayashi confirmed it. The Americans had done the impossible by making the impossible routine through overwhelming force and unlimited material. The age of American military dominance had been written in the volcanic sand of a tiny Pacific island. Japan learned the lesson too late for it to matter. By the time they fully understood what they were fighting against, the war was already decided. Iwo Jima was just one more proof of a verdict that had been rendered at Midway and confirmed in every battle since. The final truth of Iwo Jima, the truth that echoes across the decades, is that valor and sacrifice matter, but they are not sufficient alone. The Marines who raised that flag were brave. So were the Japanese soldiers who died defending their positions. Both sides displayed courage that deserved respect. But courage, without the industrial and material capacity to sustain it, is ultimately futile against an enemy that possesses both courage and overwhelming material advantages. The flag flew on Suribachi in 4 days because American industrial power made it possible for Marine courage to be effective. The mathematics that Japanese command could not believe. The impossible timeline that became reality. That was the product of industrial democracy at war, of a free society that chose total mobilization and then executed that mobilization with ruthless efficiency. 26 days to take the untakeable island. 26 days to rewrite the mathematics of Pacific warfare. 26 days to prove that abundance and determination together could accomplish what valor alone never could. The Americans had not fought fair. They had fought with everything they had, and everything they had was more than enough.